again, everyone. I hope you all have had a great last week, enjoying some summer sun with your family. All right, so last week we left off with the miraculous reconciliation or meeting of Jacob, Israel, and Esau, where God prepared the way for them to have peace together. And we also talked about the kind of two identities or two citizenships that all people in the family of faith have. First of all, they are citizens of God's kingdom, of heaven. And through God's grace, they are able to partake in His promises. But even though they have this wonderful identity, which we see when Jacob gets the name Israel, they are still living on this world in the flesh and suffering the consequences of the fall. So there's always sort of this struggle and battle between the two identities as people move from their old sinful habits towards trying to live under the way of faith until one day when they're finally totally restored. And this has to do with what we talked about way back in the beginning with Adam, the inheritance of faith from God, and the inheritance of the fall, where people are always trying to grab after worldly power rather than trusting in God's power. But we saw also at the end of that chapter the sort of, baton of faith was passed from Isaac on to his son Jacob, or Israel, when Isaac was gathered with his people. It doesn't just say died, but he ended his earthly life and went to be gathered with his people. Now, in this next chunk of the story, we're going to see the family of faith really blow up, get a lot bigger. So if you remember, God has promised Abraham that his descendants, or his children and children's children, will be more than the stars in the sky. He will have nations come out of him and kings. And if you take a look at chapter 36, you see a long list of names, which is Esau's family tree. And Esau's family is so big at this point, it's more of a nation. And this nation comes to be called the Edomites. And if you look at verses 31 through 43, we see that there are already kings in Esau's family. So here we see God's promises really coming to full fruition. And we also see in verse 7 that Jacob and Esau have so many riches, so many cattle, that they have to split up and spread out because they have been blessed so abundantly that the land can't bear them, can't hold all of them, their families, and their goods. So we just didn't read, but we skimmed over a little bit of Esau's family. Now let's turn back to Jacob, or Israel, in chapter 37 and read verses 1 through 11. Okay, so you're probably getting a little bit familiar with this tune by now. We continue to see brothers bickering with each other. And even though Jacob had to suffer the consequences of his parents playing favorites and causing jealousy, he has not totally learned his lesson, because he also plays favorites and chooses Joseph as his favorite, making him a special coat, which of course is going to make his brothers jealous. So if you can imagine when we've just had two brothers, we've already had plenty of fights, them already at each other's throats trying to kill each other, and now we've got 12 brothers. So just as we talked about the chorus of God's faithfulness and love coming back again and again, we also have sort of this off-tune chorus of the fights between brothers and siblings. Now, another important thing to notice about this is dreams are seen differently in this ancient Near Eastern context than they are today. Dreams were seen as being directly from God and saying something true and authoritative about either present reality or about what is to come in the future. So it's not like Joseph was just kind of waking up and sharing a crazy dream that he has like we sort of do today, like, oh, I dreamed I was on Mars with a bunch of cats. It wasn't something silly like that, but it was more like saying, this is the truth, and you are going to bow down to me one day. Now, how do Joseph's brothers respond differently than Joseph's father, Jacob? So, Jacob ponders these things, and he thinks about the dreams. Even though he's not super happy about them, he sort of locks them away and continues to think about them. And that is what we, as readers of the story, should also do. Remember these dreams, and let's see how and if they come into play further down the line in the story. Okay, so speaking of further down the line, we can go ahead and read what happens between Joseph and his brothers next. You can read verses 12 through 24. Okay, so now we see they have really taken action. They have come up with the plot to kill him and thrown him into a pit in the desert. Things aren't looking so good for him, but as we've seen before, God loves to work through some pretty dire, dismal situations. So let's keep reading and see what happens next. You can read verses 25 through verses 28 now. Okay, so couple things to notice. After they threw their brother in the pit, then they just settle down and decide it's time to eat some lunch while he's in there probably crying out for them to help him. So, not the kindest brothers, as you can see. But, more importantly than their cruelty, we need to notice that special phrase in verse 25, and they lifted up their eyes. So, even though Joseph's brothers aren't really showing a lot of faith, this phrase, and they lifted up their eyes, also is like a cue that God's gracious provision is moving in. So, it may not seem like everything's going perfectly for Joseph, since he has been sold into slavery to another group of people, but he's at least out of the pit. He's one step further down the road. And another important thing to notice here is how Joseph parallels or points to Jesus in this little part right here. So, if you remember from the story of Jesus and his disciples, Jesus had 12 disciples, just like there's 12 brothers. And one of Joseph's brothers, Judah, sells Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, or at least it was his idea. Similarly, Judas sells Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. In both cases, we see that people who should be loyal are selling out their beloved friend or brother for money. And we haven't talked about this word in a little while, but Joseph is acting as a type of Jesus. So someone that points forward to him and resembles him in some way. And even though this is kind of a small way at this point, he will continue to point to Jesus and resemble him more and more throughout this story. So pay attention and keep thinking about how he resembles Jesus. All right, so in the next chapter, chapter 38, we see a little bit more of Judah's character, and we read that he is marrying foreign wives, multiple ones, who are idolatrous and turning away from God. He's having sons that are so wicked, God strikes them dead. And he is lying and committing all sorts of immoral acts with others. So clearly, Judah is not the most exemplary, not the best figure to be looking up to. But this is not the end of the story for Judah. So pay attention to how he might change as we keep reading in Genesis. And now, after we got that little summary of what Judah has been up to, you all can read one final little section about Joseph to see how he compares and contrasts to Judah. And then we'll close up. So you can read chapter 39, verses 1 through 6. Okay, so here we see that Joseph is doing a lot better. Not really because of anything he's done with his hands, but because we see that the Lord is with him, and he is opening up the way for Joseph to move up. And through Joseph, God is blessing those around him already. So even though Judah is the one who tried to sell his brother as a slave, we see that Judah is really more enslaved than Joseph, because he is a slave of his fleshly ways and his evil desires, whereas Joseph may not have total physical freedom, but he is more free than Judah is, because he has the Lord with him and he is faithfully following. So thank you guys for paying attention again. Next week we'll get to see a lot more action and excitement with Joseph and his brothers. So I look forward to getting to at least be with you virtually in that. And as always, don't hesitate to send me any prayer requests or any questions that you have. All right, bye guys.